Okay, this is one of those videos that's, I guess, best started with a picture and also a question. Why is there a condom on top of some kind of a structure in the middle of the Amazon forest in Brazil? And well, the answer is for science. And that's because this turns out to be an extremely unusual and interesting structure created by something familiar to us that scientists have now figured out and whose purpose finally makes sense. And so, hello info person, this is Anton. Today we're going to discuss cicadas. Yeah, quite a transition, right? Because what we're looking at here is the central Amazonian forest, the environment that is home to some of the most complex ecosystems on the planet, that also contains this very bizarre structure that mystified biologists for a very long time. And this mystery involving these bizarre clay towers has now been officially solved by using a condom. Yeah, talk about thinking outside of the box, right? But obviously before we tackle the why, let's discuss the who. So who made this and why exactly is this so interesting? Well, the who is hiding right there. This is known as Guialna chlorogena, or in more common terms, it's also known as the architect cicada. And actually a cicada that was officially only described in 1996, once again because it lives in this ridiculously complex habitat in the Amazonian rainforest. And so these architect cicadas are actually native to the Brazilian rainforest and are slightly different from the cicadas you might be used to. And while most of us know cicadas for their very loud summer songs, and the fact that they seem to come out in broods separated by prime numbers such as every 17 years, pretty much most cicadas, most of these insects, spend the vast majority of their lives underground, and basically in a form referred to as a nymph, a kind of a worm-like creature that mostly survives by feeding on the sap of various tree roots. But here in these humid conditions in the forests near Manaus, these nymphs do something extraordinary. In the year before they undergo their final transformation and basically become the winged adults you might have seen around on a tree somewhere, which generally looks something like this, and before they molt, leaving their old body behind, these architect cicadas do something really strange. They basically build these very distinct vertical clay towers, or these chimneys, in many different locations around the rainforest, and sometimes up to heights of 40 centimeters, or just over 1 foot. And for many decades, it was not actually clear why. Basically, the purpose of these towers was purely speculative. In other words, why would this unusual insect that basically exists pretty much everywhere on the planet, and that generally look kind of similar and even have very similar lifestyles, and actually insects that existed even before dinosaurs went extinct, this is from 150 million years ago, evolve such a specific adaptation in this very specific location on the planet in the Amazon, especially because generally this would require so much energy just to produce, mostly because this was made pretty much entirely out of clay mixed with the urine of the cicada itself. In other words, in evolutionary terms, this kind of made no sense. No other cicada on the planet does this. And that's where these condoms come in because, along with several other experiments, a team of scientists whose study you can find in the description, from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, seems to have solved this once and for all. With the study basically suggesting that this is not some kind of a leftover from possibly digging underneath, but seems to be what scientists are now referring to as extended phenotype. In other words, this is a functional tool and basically seems to act as the extension of cicada's body that physically helps it survive. And so I guess let's discuss the why. Why do they do this? And so here researchers tested two main ideas: the anti-predation hypothesis and the gas exchange hypothesis. And well, first let's look at the predators. Now obviously in the Amazon there are a lot of different predators to be aware of, but for the cicadas it's really the legion ants that seem to be the major threat, and especially when the nymphs finally emerge in order to shed their skin. And these ants are particularly aggressive, and unlike other ants, do not have permanent nests and instead march in these massive swarms, actively hunting for insects and small creatures and basically consuming everything that gets in their way. You can actually check out David Attenborough's video about this, and these ants are honestly terrifying. Basically here you have a single colony of over 2 million ants operating as a kind of a unified superorganism. And well, to test this hypothesis, the team placed baits made out of sardines and flour on both the ground and the top of these towers, with the results actually being kind of surprising. For some reason, these ants were approximately 8.5 times less likely to find a bait on top of the tower compared to the bottom. In other words, the cicadas significantly reduced the risk of being eaten or even being found, and especially during its most vulnerable moment of metamorphosis. In other words, while in most places on Earth, cicadas are okay doing this on top of the tree, in the Brazilian Amazon, even the trees are not safe, so they have to improvise and create these relatively tall towers. But it was really the second experiment that obviously made headlines because, yeah, condoms. It was really the choice of the equipment. And this was also a really important test. The test of how these nymphs were breathing. Because here scientists had to find a way to completely block the air passage, or at least block the air from moving through the porous clay inside the tower. And so to do this in the middle of the remote rainforest, they used a typical latex condom. And so by slipping a condom over the tower and sealing the base with plastic film, they managed to create a barrier that stopped fresh air from entering, likely causing the nymph inside to experience respiratory stress, and specifically buildup of carbon dioxide and the lack of oxygen. And the findings in this case were quite fascinating, because on the next day researchers broke the base of the tower, removing the upper part, but leaving the base behind where the nymph was hiding, in order to see how the nymphs would respond to the damage after being suffocated by the condom. This was actually just to see how the suffocation affected them, because pretty much none of them died. And they discovered an unusual size-dependent response. Nymphs in the larger towers actually accelerated their growth, rebuilding faster than those in smaller towers, which essentially suggested that the larger towers possess a much larger volume of air inside, which acts as a kind of a buffer from stale air and improves ventilation. And at the same time, it also revealed that cicadas were aware of their environments and could change their behavior, rebuilding the home faster when the gas exchange was limited. And so the improvised use of these 40 condoms managed to solve a relatively complex physiological question in just one day. And for cicada biology, this is a really important study because the nymphal stage, the stage where they spend most of their lives underground, has historically been very poorly understood, as it's difficult to study cicadas in the wild. With this study confirming that cicadas are capable of some really complex behavior and seem to create these structures that are carefully maintained, repaired, and even opened and closed in response to environmental conditions, with the experiments confirming that this protects them from predators and also acts as a kind of a regulatory gas exchange mechanism, or I guess a kind of a straw in some sense, that seems to control physical and chemical conditions inside the nymph's burrow, helping it maintain favorable conditions. And interestingly, by doing all of this, and also obviously by interacting with the tree roots underneath, these cicadas also provide what's known as bioturbation, or basically their digging and construction dramatically influences the soil quality and indirectly improves tree growth and development. So basically, these little guys, with their somewhat bizarre tubes, seem to have a dramatic effect on the forest itself. But apart from this discovery in the Amazon, we also had a few discoveries from other locations about other cicadas, because technically the last 5 years was a kind of a cicada golden age, at least in terms of biology. And that was because in the last few years, and especially in 2024, the United States saw the massive synchronized emergence of broods 13 and 19. Or essentially we had several different broods come out at the same time, because in this case the prime numbers that they follow seem to coincide. And so there were at least some unexpected discoveries that actually debunked long-held assumptions. And one of the most surprising discoveries is in regards to the so-called 4-year gate mechanism. And so for a long time, scientists could not understand how these periodical cicadas kept track of their 13 or 17-year cycle. Basically, how do they keep track of time? And recent research suggests that they don't seem to count every single year, and instead they have some kind of an internal clock that checks in every 4 years to see if the nymph is ready to emerge. And if a nymph has reached a certain body weight by that 4-year mark, it actually triggers a major hormonal process inside that basically takes approximately 1 year before the nymph transforms and emerges from underground. And if the body is still small, it waits for the next gate, which happens in the next 4 years. And so basically for one of these cicadas, They go through 3 of these cycles, and on the year 12, their body is big enough so they emerge after 13 years. For the other cicadas, this usually involves 4 cycles, and they emerge on the 17th year. But obviously, why 4 years is another question we cannot answer. Then we had this, the jet pea physics. This was actually a somewhat bizarre discovery made by the scientists from the Georgia Tech. Now, most insects that feed on plant sap usually excrete their waste in tiny droplets just because it saves energy. But the scientists in this case discovered that cicadas seem to be the smallest animals known to us to urinate using these high-speed jets. And the question was, okay, why? Why they're so weird? And turns out that because they consume so much nutrient-poor sap, they basically have to process a lot of liquid. And so if they were to flick away individual droplets, it would take them more energy. So instead, they basically just blast it out in a single stream. And surprisingly, because this is Georgia Tech we're talking about, they are actually now applying this in order to study the efficiency of a nozzle design, because it's now being applied to various robotic studies to figure out how to create much more efficient nozzles. So definitely quite an unusual discovery. But biologists have also discovered something super strange about their wings. And that's because apparently their wings are kind of like natural daggers. If you look at their wing under a microscope, it seems to be covered in these tiny bowling pin shaped structures referred to as nanopillars, approximately 100 nanometers tall. They essentially resemble something like this. And well, this turns out to be a very interesting mechanical defense. A defense that pretty much almost always ruptures bacteria that try to land on the wings, killing any bacteria instantly. Which is obviously a really exciting discovery because now engineers are also trying to recreate this in order to create naturally sterile surfaces for example, hospitals or other locations where you don't really want to use too much chemical disinfectants. And so this has a huge potential to prevent the rise of superbugs. Definitely an unusual, unexpected, and somewhat exciting discovery. Although in this case, it's not all super positive. Scientists have also discovered something about a major parasite of cicadas that basically turns them into a kind of a zombie. And so here this involves a fungus referred to as Massospora cicadina, a zombie fungus that manipulates cicadas to infect others, but exactly how it was doing this was actually unknown. But following one of the recent studies, researchers seem to have figured it out. And in this case, the fungus produces a kind of a cocktail of chemicals, including the same chemicals found in magic mushrooms that basically make you high, and certain types of amphetamines that make cicadas super hyper. And so by keeping them hyperactive, but also keeping them hallucinating, this fungus then makes the cicadas fly around, attempting to mate with as many cicadas as possible, even though its body is technically completely falling apart as the fungus consumes it. And because it's falling apart, by interacting with other cicadas, it spreads the fungus on them, restarting the cycle once again. And so quite a scary experience, although I guess at least they're high, right? But anyway, so why does any of this matter? And why do we care about cicadas so much? Well, as I mentioned, it's really because these insects are a massive bridge between the underground root systems and the surface ecosystem. When it comes to the soil health, cicadas seem to play a major role and then serve as a major food source once they come out and start to sing their songs. In other words, apart from this process of bioturbation, which helps the soil become healthy, they actually play a major role for a lot of different ecosystems. And so the more we study them and the more we understand them, the more we learn about how they affect the planet, and the more we can learn about their strength, which we can then maybe borrow for our own needs. Such as, for example, by using the same thing they use in their wings. And so they're essentially providing us with a lot of different blueprints from biology to even robotics. But sometimes, to unlock all of these secrets, we do need to have a bit of a scientific curiosity and rely on methods that are just a little bit unusual, which is why I wanted to talk about these studies. Anyway, on that note, once we learn something else, I'll discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.